Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Good. So, I come from NINA, as we call ourselves, Norwegian Institute for Nature Research in Norway. We're a little group there who works on pink salmon, mostly sort of part-time work. And I chose this quite broad title because it's easy to do when you're asked to hold a talk. So let's just cover everything. So quickly about the sort of you can call it invasion history in our part of the world. The Russians thought it was a good idea to start moving pink salmon from the Pacific, of course, where the natural range, and into the White Sea. Let's see if this happens. Yeah, they started in the 50s and started moving fish like fry and eggs of both the odd year and the even year populations from sort of the southern parts of Sakhalin. They discontinued this in 1979 because this was unsuccessful. Didn't really work. Then they started again in 1985 and went on to about 1999, trying again with the odd year, mainly with the odd year population. And this was discontinued in 1999. They had very low returns in this entire period, and so it was sort of considered unsuccessful. And of course there were a lot of other things happening in Russia at the time, around year 2000. I might have explained why they stopped as well. So in Norway, we had our first catches of pink salmon in 1960. I only have data back to 76. But even the even year populations and the odd year populations have been very low numbers. So before 2017, we had about the even year about 500 fish at max in around 28 rivers in total. And then with the odd year, it was maximum 1,700. That was in 70, what is it, some year, in about 12 rivers. In 17, something happened, or more, I guess something happened in 15. But we had quite a massive explosion in catches of pink salmon. So about 12,000 fish were caught in 260 rivers, which is basically all of Norway, or from the north to the south. In 2 rivers, there were more than 1,000 fish that were registered. Then 2019 happened. Well, between there was 2018 with low catches. And then in 2018, we had even more fish, 19,000 fish in 180 rivers, more or less. We had then 5 rivers with more than 1,000 fish. And then last year happened, which was quite a lot more fish. So it's about, in river catches, there's about 167,000 fish. We have 20 rivers with more than 1,000 fish. And I wrote 4 rivers, but actually 5 rivers with more than 10,000 fish. There are Tana River had about 47,000 fish registered. And there's another quite a small river called the Vesterelva in sort of close to the Russian border, had over 20,000 fish. And these 5 rivers actually make up about 60% of the total river catches in this year. So they've had quite a lot of pink salmon. There's also coastal fisheries with bag nets and bend nets, and in 2019 we registered about 5,000 fish, and in last year there were about 40,000 fish that were caught in this type of fishery. So all in all, it's more than 200,000 pink salmon that were caught in Norway in total last year. So here's a little sort of a GIF showing just the distribution and sort of the historical development of pink salmon in Norway or in Norwegian rivers. So you can see that they're spread more or less all over the country. But it's important to know that you have to actually observe a pink salmon to know that it's there. So this is all sort of reported catches. So quickly about pink salmon in Norway and the history in Norway. It's an invasion history, as we just heard from the other talk. But also it's a history of observational probability. I'm a statistician, so we work a lot with observational probabilities. You have to observe something to know it's there, and then you have sort of true and false zeros in a data set. Also, before 2019, reporting pink salmon wasn't, it wasn't part of the official catch statistics pink salmon. So it was also just sort of voluntary. It's still, people can still decide if they want to report it, but it's more now in the official systems. It's possible to actually register the catch. And what we know from pink salmon in Norway are sort of a lot of different sources of data. So there's recreational fishing in rivers and in the sea. There's targeted removal fishing in rivers with nets and traps. There's bag and bend nets fishing in the sea or along the coast. There's drift counting and cameras. There's marine scientific trawls. There's marine commercial fishing. There's eDNA sampling, and we also get some information from media. Not everybody report their catch, but they talk to the media, so we get information from there. So it's sort of a big and complex data set. So current knowledge for decision makers. These are the sort of the important questions always, like why are they here, where are they, when do they come, how and what in some sort of sense. So and of course the big question is the effect on the ecosystem. So I sort of divided this into two main questions, sort of what do we know about impacts on the marine ecosystem? And what are the impacts on river ecosystems? What can we say from the data that we currently have? I'm going to present some data now from a paper that we just submitted, and along with other data that we have. So, start with why. Why the dramatic increase since 2015? Because the 2017 generation were sort of spawned in 15. It's probably climate change. We've done some modeling that shows that warmer temperatures in coastal waters in May predicts very nicely the big increase in the population. So temperature in May, this is the year of out migration, explains the high returns of the adults the next year. And this fits pretty nicely also with the information that we have from the Pacific, where they also see these temperature effects. There's at least for the odd year line, there's a decline in the populations in the southern part of the range, and there's a growth in the north. So it's getting too warm maybe in the south, and then more sort of perfect in the north. And then where are they? It's always important to know. So this is map of Norway. We usually, at least in my group, we've divided Norway into different regions. And we see that most of the fish, the vast majority of the fish is caught in these two regions, sort of northeast, close to the Russian border. it's about 80 to 90% of all the catches just in these two regions, and more than sort of 95 to 98% sometimes is actually captured in Finmark county. And this goes for both river catches and also the catches in the sea. This is bag nets and bend nets. So that's like basic general background stuff. And then I thought, okay, can we say something about the marine ecosystems and their impacts on the marine ecosystems? So an important question is then, where are they in the sea? Which is good to know. And we've looked at trawling data in the Norwegian Sea. And this is a figure showing sort of old year catches. This is catches of pink salmon in the sea, their second summer in the sea, which is the year that they return to the rivers. So we see that we catch them all the way from sort of close to Faroe Islands and up along the coast. This is the same sort of data, just a result from a statistical model showing like a heat map, and we see that they are actually located quite close to the Norwegian coast. There's a higher probability of catching them closer to the coast. Then the question is, what are they doing in the sea? Well, we find that they are actually eating, believe it or not. And then what are they actually eating? Well, they're eating a lot of fish larvae, amphipods and krills. And what we see, you can see from the figure there, that it also varies what they eat where. So they're quite opportunistic of what they're eating. And it seems like they eat whatever they can come across. And also, this is basically the same diet as salmon. Atlantic salmon, you call it, we just call it salmon. So I'm going to say salmon. And this is some pictures of what we found in the stomachs of these fish. So you can see they can actually eat quite a lot. I think this, I don't know what's it called in the Norwegian, lodde, is it? Capelin, okay. And this is a little cod down there. And you can see a lot of shrimps. And also, what are they doing? Well, they're probably growing as well in the sea. So what we find is that the fish are smaller further south, and they are bigger in the north. But I put a question mark there because there's a temporal sampling effect of this as well. So it might very well be that they're eating, or sort of growing as they move north. So from this picture, it looks like they're having this type of sort of, they move around in the Norwegian Sea. They go down, come up along the Norwegian coast, and then go up into the rivers, mainly in the north. We don't really have much data from the Barents Sea, and we haven't really found any data on catches of pink salmon there. So that's a big question mark. Then the next question is the impact in the rivers. So where are they in the rivers? Well, this is again a map of Norway and the distribution. The red dots are rivers with more than 1,000 fish. So you can see that there's been quite an increase in the population, but you find them all across the country. And of course you find them here in Scotland, and they're in Sweden and Denmark a little bit as well. But in quite low numbers. So it's mainly up here in the northeast that we find the big numbers. When do they arrive? So there's a plot on the panel on the left is the date of the first observation, and then breddegrad is that latitude in English. So you see that they actually arrive in the rivers more or less the same time in the south and in the north. And when we look at the median catch date in the rivers, they also arrive more or less in the same same time. This is just another way of looking at the same data. This is arrival date, mean arrival date in the rivers, or catch date in the rivers, and then the different years on the x-axis. And you see that there's been sort of a change over time, but we believe that this part here is more of a sampling effect rather than an actual arrival difference. So this is basically what it looks like across the country. Then we've had a little discussion earlier there when they spawn and where they spawn and what they do in the rivers. So I thought what we find is that they spawn mid-late August. They do not only spawn in lower regions of the rivers, they can move quite far up. They occupy at least the areas that they actually can reach. They spawn in the same areas as Atlantic salmon and trout. We see this is a figure showing the date of spawning on the x-axis. This is a sort of simple modeling that we've been doing, just in looking at when they spawn, when is actual swim up from the gravel. And you can see that you don't have to have much of a variation in the time of spawning to have quite a big difference in when they have swim up, and when then, of course, also affects when they move out of the rivers and when we catch them in the rivers as sort of smolts. What we see, because in 2017 we saw spawning and we found fry or smolts in the rivers in October, November, and thought, okay, they're going to die. It's not going to be much of a problem. But what we see is that, okay, we have more and more and more fish coming, more and more fish spawning. And if you just have this little variation in spawning date, then they will actually perhaps potentially do quite well. And what we see now is that they do start moving out of the rivers now. So there's potential for this being, like, our part of the world being suitable for this species. We also see that the smolts stay longer in the rivers than sort of I would see from the native range. They often move quickly out, they say. And we also see that smolt, they feed in the river. We need more data on this, of course, and there will be lots of variation. But I was thinking from the discussion we just had before I went on stage here, it's that you have to remember that there's an evolutionary history in the Pacific. You have pink salmon coexisting with 5 other species. So there might have been competition in a different way than we see, so that they might occupy the lower regions of the rivers and spawn there because there's more competition further up. And when you spawn all the way down towards the sea, fish move out. Maybe they just move a little bit in the river, but as an effect of you spawning very far down the river, you sort of, by definition, move out of the river. But here we see fish spawning like hundreds of kilometers up in river systems. It's going to take quite a while to move out of the river. So you might start eating on your way there. What kind of rivers do they like? It's also important to know. We did some modeling. This is a report that I wrote where we tried to find the mechanisms that explain the spatial distribution that we see. We used 2017 and 2019 sports fishing data, and we used these sort of proxies for sort of river, how suitable the rivers are. We've used distance to Russia, the Russian population, size of the river, size of the salmon population, which is the catches from Atlantic salmon, I should say, and then size, depth, temperature, salinity of the estuary. put this into a model, see what we can find. We divided the country in two. Most of the catches are done in the north, so we divided the analysis into north and the rest. What we find, first of all, same rivers receive high numbers of pink salmon year after year. So there might be some homing there. Distance to Russia is important in both these years. As you saw, most of the catches are done in close to the Russian border, also in last year. The size of the river and also then the size of the salmon population are important. They explain sort of why certain rivers get more pink salmon than others. What's a little bit interesting is that size of river is more important in the south of Norway than in the north. And the size of the river is more important in 2017 than it was in 2019. And what this might indicate is that sort of the south of Norway is on the sort of the invasion front. Not that much pink salmon, they're not established, so they might be attracted more to just fresh water when they're moving along the coast. We also see that size river more important in 2017 and 19, which might also show that once they've established in an area, and especially in the north, this size effect sort of was completely removed. It's more random where they end up. Once you've established and once you start sort of moving into an area, you might just occupy everything that's possible in that area. But once you move further south, you might go to the bigger rivers. We use this knowledge to model sort of future, what do you call it? Where they'll be in the future, and just sort of to find suitable rivers based on these characteristics. So it's quite a useful, just a statistical way of looking at the probability of you getting pink salmon in a specific river in Scotland. So that's the map showing the reds are where that's highly likely, high numbers of rivers that are suitable for pink salmon, and the blues are not. Of course, based on catch statistics, and there's observational probability stuff in there. But the model is actually quite correct, and it predicts quite well what rivers we expect to have quite a lot of pink salmon in. It's also a very useful tool for this kind of stuff. I'm not going to go into details, but it's useful for management to see what rivers underperform or overperform year after year. So do you get more pink salmon than you predicted, or do you get less than you predicted? Which makes it possible to actually look more into this river. Is there something about the location? Or is it something about the activity going on? There are certain rivers that we see, big rivers, should have loads of pink salmon. This is Alta. Should have loads of pink salmon, underperforms every year. Mostly because of it's difficult to catch the pink salmon there. And maybe also because how the fishing is organized in that river. So statistics can be complicated and difficult sometimes, but it's also very useful. And then a very important question, homing. Do they actually return to the river that they were sort of born in? And how can we look at this? We don't really know yet, but there are certain things we can sort of look at and give us a clue whether this is happening or not. This is catches in rivers, and it's the size of the fish in the rivers. And what we see is that there's bigger fish in the north and smaller fish in the south. So it might suggest that the fish in the north come from somewhere else, or they occupy different areas, and the fish in the south come from somewhere else. That was length. We can look at weight, which is even a stronger signal here. You can see the blue dots is sort of smaller fish and bigger fish in the north. So it might give you, so we have some regional differences in size of the fish when they enter the rivers. So they might potentially occupy different areas in the sea, etc. And we can see this also if you look at the size of the fish from the trawls, the marine trawls. We see sort of the same pattern there, but it's difficult to know because of the temporal effect there whether this is actually fish. These fish are smaller and they enter the rivers, and these enter the rivers here. Don't really know yet, but it might give us a little bit of a clue. We also have some results from scale analysis of pink salmon that indicate that fish caught in the north have better early marine growth or compared to fish from the middle of Norway, which might actually indicate that they grow up in different areas. So they grow better, the ones that are caught in these rivers as adults, and or they grow better than the ones that we catch in the middle of Norway. So it might indicate perhaps the ones in the north grew up here and these grew up here. Maybe it indicates sort of different environmental conditions during early life. And then to further look on sort of if they actually spawn in rivers and if they return to the rivers, if we have sort of specific river populations of pink salmon. There's the genetic analysis. We've started doing some work on this. And I'm not going to go into any details, but it works quite well. This is a parental analysis and looking at siblings and half-siblings, etc., in the river. And this can give us insight into the homing to these rivers and also the effective number of breeders in these rivers. So from all the data, you saw this in the beginning, all this sort of chaos of different sources of data. We can actually piece all this together and get a pretty good understanding of the population dynamics and distributions and temporal trends and geographical trends, etc., in the country. So that I would really suggest you start gathering this data as well. It's important. So what can we say? What's the current knowledge? Of course, there's a lot of things I haven't mentioned that we can discuss later. But pink salmon seem to migrate around in the Norwegian Sea, close to the Norwegian coast, from south to north. So they go out, take a trip around. They eat pretty much everything and eat the same as Atlantic salmon. We don't know too much about what they're doing in the Barents Sea. There's fish going out there as well, so we would like to have more data on that. The majority of pink salmon in Norway are caught in the northeastern Finmark. And you can see the numbers, like there's hundreds, like almost, 150,000 or so caught up there. So it's quite a lot. And they seem to be, at least sort of in their invasion front, seem to be initially attracted to large rivers. When they're first established in an area, they pretty much go everywhere. Upmigration in rivers is June to August. The median week is usually around week number 29 to 30, which is like mid-July. Pink salmon are bigger in the north than in the south, which might indicate that they occupy different areas in the sea with different resource availability. It's an interesting question. A question we have, of course, in Norway is how much spillover is there from Russia, from the White Sea? The fish that go out into the White Sea, out into the Bering Sea, do they all go back to Russian rivers, or do they actually sort of spill over into Finmark? When you talk about the numbers that we have, they're going to be 10 times, maybe more in Russia or in the White Sea. So you just need a small percentage of fish sort of not going where they're supposed to, and then you have a lot of fish in Norway as well, and the rest of the world, or at least North Atlantic. And then maybe this can tell us something about homing in the rivers. Spawning mid-late August, occupy same areas in the rivers as Atlantic salmon and trout, at least the areas that they can reach. I didn't mention this, I just remembered, but when the size difference you saw from the south to north of fish caught in the rivers, there was the fish in 2017 and 2021 were much bigger than the ones caught in 2019. And there were a lot of sort of course, anecdotal data, but a lot of people, as Eirik mentioned, like fish in 2019 actually being able to move up fish ladders, move up sort of small waterfalls that they hadn't observed before. And we do find here that the condition of the fish was actually much better in 2021 than in 19, which might actually explain why they can sort of get to new areas in the rivers, which of course is representative of the conditions in the sea. So that's pretty much all I was going to say today. A lot of information, can't possibly cover everything now, but that's the story in Norway, at least. Thank you.